take the use of voice. The use of your voice. Now, what's a proper way to use your voice? If your child is in the second floor and is asleep and his window is open and the stairwell is ablaze and you are outside, what's a good way to use your voice? Yeah, to put it mildly. Barnabas! And nobody on the street would say, oh, listen to that pastor. Just listen to him. It could ruin his voice, or something like that. So in an emergency, a whole different expectation is appropriate.
I didn't expect a teaching on worship to start with a burning staircase, but that's the kind of illustration that makes you stop and think. What does urgency sound like in worship? What should it sound like? I'm Dan Kruver. In this episode of Light and Truth, we're listening in on a Wednesday evening teaching where John Piper offers a wide-angle view of worship, covering everything from musical styles to moments of crisis and why we need both. This teaching was originally delivered at Bethlehem Baptist Church on October 3rd, 1990.
Let me introduce a whole new continuum. You know, we've been working on this folk culture, fine culture continuum. I've got two more continuums to deal with. And I have more questions here than I do answers. And I'm really just about 6 hours ahead of you in my thinking process. So I'm throwing this out for interaction. I bowed my head this morning and I said, now Lord, what's the next step? How can we make progress here in discussing the kinds of elements of worship and the forms and whatnot and applying all this? And this is what came to my mind. The continuum of crisis and comfort. Or another way to put it would be emergency and security. Now what I want to do is show you that the more you tend towards being in a situation of comfort and security, the more one kind of form will feel right and good, and the more you tend towards a situation of crisis and emergency, the more another kind. So let me give you some examples so you see what I mean. Take the use of voice. The use of your voice. Now what's a proper way to use your voice? If your child is in the second floor and is asleep and his window is open and the stairwell is ablaze and you are outside, what's a good way to use your voice? Yeah, to put it mildly. Barnabas! And nobody on the street would say, oh, listen to that pastor. Just listen to him. It could ruin his voice, or something like that. So in an emergency, a whole different expectation is appropriate. And the other one I thought of, would be a solo in church. Say I think of Cindy Calvin or Cindy Nelson or Sarah Palermo, and for them to stand up and say, Barnabas, like I just said it, would not be appropriate. There's a measured control. There's certain constraints upon them, and they sing their song. So security and comfort and order call for different kind of expression, whereas crisis and emergency doesn't. Here's another one, eating. Eating down here. In an emergency, like starvation or being thirsty, if you're in the desert and you haven't had anything to drink for 2.5 days and you come upon a little oasis, you will not think about how to hold your cup just so. You won't worry about mother's statements about not slurping. You will simply suck. You will get your head in that water and you will get something into your body to save your life. But if you're out for a restaurant at an anniversary and you're eating, you don't drink like that. Here's another one, dress. I thought of the burning house again. I can imagine a situation where you run outside in your bathrobe because your house is on fire, and the neighborhood gathers all around and sees you in your bathrobe standing there, and you don't even think about it. They don't think about it. They're so heartbroken that your house is ablaze, and they're so glad everybody's safe that wearing a bathrobe in the backyard during that moment of time is right. It's okay. Nobody balks at all. But on the other hand, when it's time to go to a concert or something, you wouldn't wear your bathrobe, but you would take maybe an hour to fix your hair and your dress and your suit or whatever. So utterly different are the appropriate expressions. Prayer. How would you pray over your little baby boy or Barnabas if he got hit by a car on the street and you saw it happen? And you ran out and you knelt down over his body, and there was this big right here where he got hit, and you know he's breathing or not. What would be the expressions of praise? They would probably be of the most groaning, earning, God help him, God save him, God don't let him die. And anybody looking on wouldn't say, fake emotion. Nobody would. But at the dinner table, when it's breakfast time, it's 6:30 in the morning, and it's time to pray, probably if you prayed with those very same tones, the kids would all look up and say, he's crazy, something happened to him this morning. There's an appropriate, measured, even we use form at our table. We have memorized prayers that we use periodically that are crafted poems, and that would be absolutely ridiculous on the street over your dying child. No, he lays him down to sleep or something, it would be so ludicrous. One more, shelter. In an emergency, the simplest shelter will do. A shack will do. A tent will do. But if you have to deal long-term in a neighborhood, and it's where you're going to be for a long time, and life is not threatened at this moment, you have time to paint and to build and to put a roof on, then you'll build something nicer and more stable and lasting. Now, let me draw some conclusions from these observations. The greater the crisis and emergency, the less one has of freedom and privilege of fine culture expressions that take time and demand much of their listener. You see, that's the two things. Fine culture expressions demand a lot from the producer, and they demand a lot from the receiver if there's going to be understanding. Well, you don't have that luxury when you're dealing in a crisis situation. Rather, there is a tendency in folk culture expressions, a tendency to use folk culture expressions in those moments because of the demands of immediacy, which is what folk culture is good at, and the need of putting as few demands on the mind as possible. If we live only in a state of crisis, life will be reduced to survival elements. You can see that. The world will not live this way. The world around us will not live this way. They refuse to live this way if they can help it. There's some cultures and situations where they don't have any choice but to live at the level of survival. But the world in America, for example, won't live this way. And therefore, if we only live at the level of survival and give no effort to the kinds of reflections and writings and productions that you can only do in some measure of contentment and leisure and comfort and security, then the world will take over all the culture, and it will govern and control all the thought life and all the media and all the opinion making of the country. Yet, the local church is more a rescue mission than a fine arts conservatory. Now, there may be one of the most, and here I'm taking a stand, okay? This you can raise a question here about this, because this begins to have implications practically real clear. The local church is more like a rescue mission than a fine arts conservatory. Now, I'm stating it in terms of tendencies here rather than it is a rescue mission or it is a fine arts conservatory, or it isn't. There are elements of the fine culture that I think are going to be here, and there's elements of emergency crisis ministry. And I think that it's just the nature of the church as a local church, the expression of the body of Christ, where the ministry is full and well-orbed rather than specialized, to be more like a rescue mission than a fine arts conservatory. And then maybe there needs to be a little branch of the church over here that creates a Christian fine arts conservatory, and a few people will be called over there to cultivate and develop that kind of ministry, and then the kickback would be periodic or some kind of weaving in of that excellence into this rescue mission. And then other kinds of things can be developed as well. It is not only a rescue mission dealing in crisis, rescues, and reclamation, but it is more this than the other. Now, there are a lot of churches where that's not true. There are a lot of fine artsy churches that don't rescue anybody, but have good organ concerts and nice architecture and high-class people who come dressed up real well and talk about the excellence of everything. This means that the church, with this self-understanding of a rescue mission, will tend toward more folk culture expressions. And that's a decision that one has to make about the nature of the church that we want to be. One last observation on this. The kind of folk expressions will depend largely on the sort of people being rescued from crises. But this starts to lead now to my second continuum. At this point, I only want to stress that the more one is oriented on crisis, and the more extensive the crises are, the more one's ministry will be toward folk and less toward fine. So if you got a ministry right on Franklin, in a storefront situation, you probably won't have too many choir anthems. You won't have too much classical music. You won't have too much of anything that puts too much demand, very much demand at all, on the intellectual capacities of your people. Now let me lay out here one other continuum. And this is where we started the session tonight. The continuum of worship for outsiders and worship for insiders. By that I mean unbelievers. Or let's put it like that. I could say unchurched, unbelievers, and believers. Now, the two verses that I gave you for these were Ephesians 5:18 and 19 says that we are addressing each other with songs and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord in our hearts. And then the text I gave you here was Psalm 57:9 is the key verse. Now, there are other verses we could use, but maybe that's enough just to show that biblically it might be appropriate to read one other or two from the Old Testament, because we're all pretty familiar with worshiping with ourselves to the glory of God, and we're less familiar of thinking in terms of the worship of God in a non-Christian setting. Psalm 96. Oh, sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord, all the earth. Sing to the Lord and bless His name. Tell of His salvation from day to day. Declare His glory among the nations, His marvelous works among all the peoples. For great is the Lord and greatly to be praised. So singing to the Lord, telling of His salvation, declaring His glory, I think all is intended to be done among the nations in that verse. Psalm 105, verses 1 and 2 says, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, call on His name, make known His deeds among the peoples, sing to Him, sing praises to Him, tell of all His wonderful works, glory in His holy name." So you make known His deeds among the peoples and sing to Him, and turn to 108:3 for one other. 108 verse 3, "I will give thanks to Thee, O Lord, among the peoples. I will sing praises to Thee among the nations." We don't have a conception of missionary activity that is worship. But here, that seems to me to be what that is. I will sing praises to the Lord out there where they can hear me. That seems to be what's going on here. Or in here when they hear me, when they come here. Now, here we would ask, what forms and kinds of music would not be perceived as excessively boring or unmoving? I'm stating it like that. I'm stating it like that to avoid saying what kinds of music would unbelievers like to hear. Rather, I'm stating it, what kinds of music would come as far as you can come appropriately so as to provide as little stumbling block as possible. Because I want to put down here that I believe there is evil music, quite apart from words. I believe that. Let me give you an example that's real extreme, just to see if I can get you to agree with me in principle, if not in application to specific music. There was a wave of music in the 60s when I was in college. The reason I remember this is because I was reading my old journal yesterday. For some reason, I went back to read my 1967-68 journal. And they played some music in chapel, and I wrote it up in my journal called Dehumanized Music, which was just wild cacophony of sounds and screams and hollerings and utterly out of sync music. And then you remember Cage and the boys, and I remember one concert in New York where he sat down at the piano for an hour and never touched the keys. Everybody clapped at the end. And then Chickens walking up and down the keyboard and recording it and selling it. Now, when you listen to this, quote, music, that is the putting together of sounds that flow in some way, and you call it music, I think there's evil in it. And the evil simply is this. It is, if there's a God, and if He loves music and makes music, then there is a music that conforms to God, that says something right about God, and there's music that says something wrong about God. And I believe anarchy is wrong. God is not a God of anarchy. So music that tends to anarchy is bad music. And there is anarchical music in the world. Music that you can hear screaming, I will not submit to anybody's conception of what makes good music. It just screams that. So that's a conviction of mine. You don't have to share it. But I believe there is evil music, and I believe there is music that comes far closer to expressing the character of God. And that's why when I state the question of how you might meet unbelievers, I wrote it like this, we would ask what forms and kinds of music, etc., would not be perceived as excessively boring or unmoving. And goodness gracious, within the bounds of music that is not evil, the other end, and music that is perfect, down here, just barely not evil and perfect, is just an endless range of possibilities of all kinds of music. I don't know enough about music to defend this, but I would guess that if you could give me all the forms of music that you know, different categories of music, that probably there is good and bad in each of those, as even God would judge good and bad. Now, the question we'd ask over here, worship for insiders and believers, would relate to everything that we've been talking about for 2 weeks. Number one, we would ask, can we balance the varying tastes of the congregation? That'd be one goal. To try to find good music that touches a whole variety of tastes. And I'm using the word taste in a profound way, not a light way. And then secondly, can we balance folk and fine for their varied virtues and avoiding their varied vulnerabilities? I don't think that's quite the same as taste, although they overlap. And all the while assuming good biblical theology as the content to all this music. Now, what I said over here was we have to ask, how can we meet all the tastes? Number one question, if we can. And those might be a whole mixture of fine and folk. And the second question I asked was, how do you mix properly the folk and the fine? Now, let me relate that to this. It really depends on who you want to get. See, doesn't it? I mean, it's real simple when it comes right down to it. If you want to worship for the sake of outsiders, a la Psalm 57:9, you have to ask which outsiders? Bluegrass outsiders or Ordway outsiders? And it's the same principle with both. Now, there are different vulnerabilities. See, the tendency and danger of snobbishness and elitism will be much greater in a church that says, we are going to build a church among the well-to-do, who would tend to be the fine artsy people, and we are going to try to rescue them because they're in crisis. They're going to hell, which is the worst crisis of all. Poverty and hunger and lack of education is not the worst crisis. Hell is the worst crisis. And so that just cuts across all socioeconomic levels. And so if you said, we want to build a church and we want to get as many unbelievers in here as we can by playing music that they like, you haven't answered the question yet. Who? What music? What tastes are you going to appeal to now? What level? Baby boomers? 50-year-olds? Baby busters? Which group are you going to try to please here now with your music in order to win them into the kingdom? Yeah, the question is there any sense in which our lukewarm spirituality might contribute to our taste in music? And I think there is. And it cuts both ways. I mean, it cuts both ways. It can diminish your taste for the Hallelujah chorus, and it can diminish your taste for Shine Jesus Shine, or it can diminish your taste for the organ and diminish your taste for the drums. It just, sin can cut all over the place.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Light and Truth, where we are committed to providing God-centered preaching to help you see Christ clearly and treasure Him truly. I'm your host, Dan Kruver. On our next episode, John Piper continues our 9-part series, The Shape of Worship in a Changing World, with a seminar titled, Singing the Old and the New. I hope you'll join us. For more resources, visit desiringgod.org.